My name is Claire Bennett, and I was 52 years old when my husband, Ethan, stood in a courtroom and called me useless. It was a Tuesday morning in October, courtroom 4 of the family court building, cold light spilling down from the high windows onto the oak benches. I sat on the left, my attorney, a young woman named Rosalind Ferreira, whom I'd only hired 3 weeks earlier, because I'd put off finding a lawyer for as long as I possibly could, beside me, flipping through pages of a file she'd already read more times than I could count. Across the aisle, Ethan sat rigid in a grey suit he'd bought specifically for the occasion. His attorney, Grant Malone, a man in his 60s with a deep, even voice, stood to deliver the opening statement. Your Honor, Malone said, my client, Mr. Ethan Bennett, spent 22 years building a career, a home, and a future for his daughter, largely on his own. Throughout that time, Mrs. Claire Bennett was frequently absent for months at a stretch for personal work, and when she returned, she brought with her what we must describe as serious psychological instability, nighttime panic episodes, prolonged silences, and an emotional distance that meant this family was never truly whole. I stared straight ahead, keeping my breathing even. I'd learned how to do that a long time ago, from nights in a field tent, listening to distant artillery, learning not to let my heartbeat betray my face. We believe, Malone continued, that Mrs. Bennett made no significant financial contribution to the marital estate, and that most of Mr. Bennett's success, the company, the house, the stability their daughter enjoyed, was the result of my client's efforts alone. Ethan nodded along with every sentence, not looking at me. When it was his turn to speak, he stood, and his voice, the voice I once loved, the one I used to hear over the phone at midnight when I called home from a refugee camp 12 time zones away, now sounded strange to me. She'd leave for months at a time, he said. I was home alone raising Mia through exams, fevers, nights she cried asking where her mother was. I built the company alone, from one small restaurant to 12 locations. She was only there, physically, when she was there at all. And most of the time, I didn't know where she was, what she was doing, or why she couldn't just be a normal wife, a normal mother. I looked down at my hands folded in my lap. 18 years earlier, these hands had been soaked in a stranger's blood, holding an artery together through the third aftershock of the day. Now they were simply the hands of a 52-year-old woman being described in court as a faint shadow in her own life. I didn't push back. I'd learned long ago that some battles aren't won with words, and that sometimes silence is the only thing keeping you from falling apart in front of a room full of people. Then something happened at the front of the courtroom. The presiding judge, Marcus Chen, a man in his mid-40s, hair silvering early, the kind of sharp eyes you see in people who've spent a career adjudicating the truth, suddenly stopped his pen mid-note. He looked at me, not the usual passing glance of a judge observing a party. He stared, his expression shifting from professional detachment to something like shock, then something close to fear of his own memory. I'm sorry, he said, his voice unusually soft, breaking entirely the formal rhythm of the proceedings. Were you ever in Bandar Seri? 15 years ago. The whole courtroom went quiet. Malone stopped mid-sentence. Ethan turned to look at me, his face full of confusion, as if he'd just realized there was a piece of my life he'd never known existed. Yes, I answered, my own voice sounding strange to me. I was. Judge Chen sat in silence for a long moment. The pen trembled slightly in his hand. Finally, he addressed the courtroom, his voice regaining some of the composure of someone presiding over a court of law, though his eyes never left me. The court needs a 15-minute recess. He stood and left the bench, glancing at me once more before disappearing behind the chamber door. 15 minutes turned into 40. When Judge Chen returned, he didn't sit back down right away. He stood there for a moment, looking down at the bench, then up at the room. Before we continue, he said, I need to share something. Not as a judge. As a person who happens to be sitting in this seat today. He told the story of 15 years earlier, when he'd been a 25-year-old relief volunteer, fresh out of school, on his first trip abroad for a humanitarian mission. He'd arrived in Bandar Seri 3 days after a 7.8 magnitude earthquake had flattened most of the coastal town. I wasn't trained for what I saw there, he said, his voice growing distant, as if he were telling the story to himself more than to the room. On my second day, another aftershock hit. I was helping clear debris from a half-collapsed building when a section of wall came down on me. 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung. I couldn't scream. I could only breathe, or try to. He paused, taking a long breath, as if the telling itself made it hard to breathe. A woman crawled through the rubble to reach me. She didn't have proper equipment. Every piece of medical gear, at that point, had either been used up, or was buried somewhere. She reached her arm through a narrow gap, and kept my airway open, with a piece of tubing she'd improvised from whatever she could find, for 40 straight minutes, until the rescue team dug an opening wide enough to get me out. He looked at me. I never saw her face clearly. There was just dust and shadow. All I remembered was her voice, impossibly calm in the middle of all that chaos, repeating over and over, "You're going to be okay. I'm not leaving. You're going to be okay." "I've carried that sentence for 15 years, he said, without ever knowing whose voice it was. I tried to find out once, asking around through relief organizations, but no one could confirm exactly who'd been at that spot at that time. This morning, when Mrs. Bennett handed over her identification papers to sign, I saw a long scar across her wrist, the kind you get from sharp debris cutting into you while you're holding someone's airway open with your bare hands. And her voice, when she answered her lawyer's question a moment ago, I recognized it." The courtroom went dead silent. Ethan looked at me as though seeing me for the first time in 22 years of marriage. For 18 years, before I met and married Ethan, and for several more years into our marriage, I had led a mobile surgical team for an international humanitarian medical organization operating across crisis zones around the world. We showed up in places that had just been through earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, and armed conflict, places where the local healthcare system had either completely collapsed or never existed in the first place. I kept hundreds of people alive under conditions so desperate that sometimes we operated by headlamp, boiled water instead of proper antiseptic, and did direct person-to-person blood transfusions, because there wasn't time or supply for anything else. I met Ethan during a short break between missions, when I'd come home to attend a college friend's wedding. He was a young chef back then, just opening his first restaurant, full of energy and plans. We fell for each other faster than I ever expected of myself, a woman used to never attaching herself to anything for long, because she knew her work could call her away at any moment. We married 6 months later. I kept working for the first few years, cycling between long deployments and brief stretches at home. When Mia was born, I scaled back, but never fully stopped, partly because the organization was always short on experienced staff, partly because, if I'm honest, I didn't know who I was if I wasn't the person showing up when someone needed it most. I never told Ethan the details of what I saw on those trips. Not because he didn't ask. In the early years, he still asked, still tried to understand. But I always deflected, changed the subject, said nothing worth mentioning, just work. I didn't want to bring that brutality home. I didn't want it anywhere near Mia when she was small, didn't want the dinner table to become a place where I recounted deaths I couldn't prevent, faces I still saw every time I closed my eyes. Slowly, that avoidance became a wall. Ethan stopped asking. I stopped telling. And in that gap, he started interpreting my silence his own way, not as protection, but as distance, as a sign that I wasn't really there, even when I was standing in our own kitchen. The person I kept most hidden, the one I never once mentioned to anyone in my family, was Priya Malik. Priya was the nurse who worked alongside me for 6 years, across 4 different relief missions on 3 continents. She had a smile that could steady anyone spiraling into panic, and an uncanny ability to know exactly which instrument I needed before I asked for it. We used to joke that if either of us ever left the field, the other would feel like she'd lost an arm. Priya died during a flood relief mission, when a makeshift structure being used as a field clinic collapsed, while she was trying to pull an 8-year-old child out of the wreckage of a neighboring house. The child survived. Priya didn't. I was less than 50 meters away when it happened. I was the first to reach her, the first to try to resuscitate her, and the last one holding her hand when there was nothing left to do. I kept a photo of Priya, the 2 of us laughing in front of a field tent, covered in dust, but happy in the way only people who've faced the worst together can be, in the bottom drawer of my desk at home, along with the old stethoscope I no longer used. No one in my family had ever seen either of them. I closed that drawer every time I opened it, like closing a door to a room I didn't want anyone else stepping into. While Ethan grew his restaurant chain from a single corner shop into 12 locations, he never knew that I had quietly saved his company from the brink of bankruptcy once, in the 8th year of our marriage. It was the period when the company had expanded too fast, taking on debt to build 3 new locations at once, right as an economic downturn hit, and revenue dropped sharply. The bank threatened to seize the collateral. Ethan barely slept for weeks, hiding the severity of it from me, either because he didn't want me to worry, or maybe out of a man's pride that couldn't admit he was failing. I found out when I happened to see a bank letter he'd left on his desk. I didn't tell him I'd seen it. Instead, I quietly contacted my own bank, using nearly all of my personal savings from years of work, plus a mortgage on my mother's old house, the last piece of my family left, the house I grew up in, to move enough money into the company's account right when it was needed most. I did it through my own attorney, under the guise of an anonymous investor interested in the company's business model. Ethan never knew. All he knew was that, miraculously, the company survived its worst stretch, and for years afterward, he told the story as proof of his own resilience and business instincts. I never corrected him. At the time, I believed that was what a wife should do, quietly, without needing credit, without needing gratitude. I was used to giving without expecting to be seen, because that was exactly what my work had taught me for years. The best person in a crisis is the one who doesn't need applause. I also never told anyone, including Ethan, that for the past 10 years, since the day Priya died, I had been quietly paying the full college tuition for her son, a boy who lost his mother at 12, raised by an aunt in another city. My monthly transfers went out under the name Bandar Seri Anonymous Scholarship Fund, processed through an intermediary organization to make sure no one could trace it back to me. The boy, now a 22-year-old man, had no idea who was behind the scholarship that let him pursue his dream of becoming a doctor, just like the mother he'd lost. After Judge Chen shared his story and publicly announced he would recuse himself from the case due to a personal conflict of interest, even though he'd never known who I was before that morning, the atmosphere in the courtroom had completely shifted. But Ethan and his attorney still tried to hold their original position. "That's a very moving story, Your Honor," Malone said, more cautious now but still firm, "but with respect, it doesn't change the financial reality of this divorce. Contributions from the distant past, however admirable, aren't evidence of contributions to the recent marriage, or to the current state of assets that need to be divided." That was when the courtroom door at the back opened. Not one person walked in. More than 30 did, quietly filing in and finding seats in the gallery, all dressed as if they'd prepared for this moment in advance, though in reality they'd only learned about the hearing a few hours earlier, through a contact network of former relief workers, after one of them had spotted my name in the court's public records. They'd rearranged their schedules, booked flights, driven hundreds of miles. No one asked them to. No one knew in advance whether their presence would even matter. They just knew that the woman who'd once saved their lives was being called useless in a courtroom, and that wasn't something they could let stand. One man stood first. Once the new judge temporarily presiding after Chen's recusal allowed a brief statement with both attorneys' consent. He introduced himself as Thomas Herrera, a former rescue engineer in Bandar Seri, someone I'd saved twice during the same mission, once pulling him out of a flash flood's undertow, once performing emergency surgery on a severe infected wound right at the scene because there wasn't time to move him to the field hospital. Another woman, Dahlia Okonkwo, told the court that when her daughter was diagnosed with a rare illness and insurance refused to cover an expensive specialty medication, I, by then years removed from relief work, but still in touch with the old network, had quietly covered her daughter's hospital bills for 8 months of treatment, never leaving my name, until the girl recovered and a nurse accidentally let it slip. A much younger man, around 22, stood up last, his voice shaking. "My name is Dania Malik," he said. "I just graduated medical school last month. I got into school on an anonymous scholarship I never knew the source of, until this morning, when I saw Mrs. Bennett's name in an article about this hearing, and the intermediary organization managing the scholarship confirmed it to me over the phone an hour ago." He looked at me, his eyes red. "My mother's name was Priya Malik. She died when I was 12. I always wondered how I could possibly have gotten into medical school without that scholarship. I don't know what to say except, thank you. And I think my mother would be so proud that she got to work alongside you." I couldn't hold myself together anymore. For the first time in the entire hearing, tears fell, not because I'd been hurt, but because 10 years of a carefully kept secret had finally been seen, in a way I'd never prepared myself for. Ethan looked at me, then at Dania, then down at his own hands, unable to say a word. During the second recess, as everyone tried to regain their composure, my daughter, Mia, 20 years old and a junior in college, pulled me out into the hallway, her hands trembling as she held a USB drive and a printed folder. "I found this on Dad's old computer 2 weeks ago," she said, her voice breaking. "I wasn't looking for anything, I was just helping him transfer company files to his new laptop, because he asked me to. But I found a folder with a strange name, and when I opened it, I didn't understand what I was reading. I've been sitting on it for 2 weeks, not knowing what to do. But after everything that just happened in there, I think you need to see this now." It was a set of internal financial reports for the restaurant chain, completely different from the numbers Ethan's attorney had submitted to the court in the divorce filing. The company's actual value, according to this document, was more than double what had been officially declared. It looked like a portion of the assets had been shifted into other legal entities, or deliberately undervalued to reduce the share subject to division in the divorce. And under a section titled Startup Capital and Crisis Relief, Year 8, where the source of the money that had saved the company from bankruptcy should have been listed, my name had been completely erased from the list of contributors. In its place was a line reading, "Ethan Bennett's own capital, through personal financial restructuring." I stood frozen in the hallway, holding the folder, feeling every last piece of the picture click into place. It wasn't just being called useless in court. It was that, for 14 years, the most important contribution I had ever made to this family had been erased from the record, quietly, deliberately, to serve a different story about who had actually built everything we had. I handed the folder and the drive to my attorney, Rosalind, the moment the hearing resumed. As the evidence was submitted to the court, and with more than 30 people's eyes still on him, Ethan's expression slowly shifted from defensive to something close to collapse. Malone tried to push back, arguing they needed time to verify the authenticity of the documents, that this might be some error in internal data storage. But Ethan, for the first time in the entire hearing, didn't let his attorney continue. "Stop," he said, his voice hoarse. The courtroom went silent. He stood up, not waiting to be recognized, and turned to face me directly, for the first time all morning, truly looking me in the eye. "I needed you to look useless," he said, his voice breaking on every word, "so I wouldn't have to admit what kind of person I'd become." He paused, taking a breath, as if forcing himself through the next sentence. "For years, I knew you were carrying things I didn't dare ask about. I knew, somewhere deep down, that the money that saved the company that year didn't just appear out of nowhere. I just chose not to ask, because asking would mean admitting I'd failed, and that you'd quietly cleaned up that failure for me. I knew you were still waking up at 3 in the morning from dreams you never talked about. I used to lie next to you, feel you shaking in your sleep, and I chose to pretend I didn't notice, because facing it would mean asking what you'd been through, and I was afraid the answer would make me feel small." He looked down at his hands. "Instead of asking, I chose to believe an easier story, that you were distant because you didn't care, that your silence was a flaw, not a wound. Because if you were the strongest person in this house for 22 years, then I'd have to face the truth that I was never really the provider I always took pride in claiming to be." He turned to his attorney. "I'm firing you, Grant. Thank you for doing exactly what I asked of you, but I can't keep going down this road." Malone, after a stunned moment, nodded and began gathering his papers, asking the court's permission to withdraw as counsel. Ethan turned back to me. "I want to divide the assets fairly, based on what you actually contributed, not on what I deliberately hid to make your share look smaller." The hearing was postponed for a week to give both sides time to renegotiate, with new counsel for Ethan, and a full re-verification of the financial records by an independent auditor appointed by the court. During that week, I went back to the old house, where Ethan and I had been living separately for 6 months since the divorce proceedings began, each of us somewhere else now, and for the first time in years, I opened the bottom drawer of the old desk I'd kept from our previous home. I took out Priya's photo, set it on the desk, looked at her dust-covered smile, and for the first time in 10 years, I cried without holding anything back. Mia visited me on Thursday evening, bringing a pizza box, and sat down beside me on the couch. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner about what I found," she said. "I was afraid it would make everything worse." "You have nothing to apologize for," I said. "You did the right thing." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, her voice smaller, "Mom, can I ask about your work?" About what you did, before you had me. That was the first time in 20 years that I truly started to tell her. Not everything, there were memories I still wasn't ready to share, might never be ready to share, but I told her about Priya, about Bandar Seri, about sleepless nights in field tents, about why I'd chosen silence for so many years. Mia listened, never interrupting, only occasionally squeezing my hand tighter. I think, she said finally, you spent your whole life saving other people, to the point where you forgot that sometimes you need saving too. I couldn't answer right away, but I knew my daughter had just said something I'd never had the courage to admit to myself. A week later, the hearing resumed under a different judge, Yolanda Reyes, after Chen formally recused himself over the conflict of interest. The independent audit confirmed that what MIA's documents had shown was accurate. The company's actual value was significantly higher than originally declared, and my financial contribution in the 8th year of our marriage, even though made anonymously, was verified through bank records and testimony from the attorney who had represented me in that transaction. Ethan, with new counsel, agreed to a far more equitable asset division than the original proposal, including full recognition of my role in saving the company from bankruptcy that year. He also didn't oppose my request to set aside a portion of the assets to establish a charitable fund. After the agreement was signed and the legal process was nearly finalized, we sat down together one last time in a small courthouse meeting room, just the two of us, no attorneys, no one else. I don't expect you to forgive me, Ethan said. I just want you to know that I understand, finally, I understand, how wrong I was. I'm not sure I'm even angry anymore, I said, and realized as I said it that it was true. I think I'm more sad than anything. Sad that we had 22 years together, and neither of us was brave enough to really see the other one. He nodded, his eyes red. I wish I'd asked you more, instead of choosing to believe the easier story. And I wish I'd given you the chance to ask, I said. I closed myself off for so long, I forgot that silence is a choice too, and not always the right one. We sat there for a long while, not saying anything more, just present together in the final silence of a marriage that had ended, but, perhaps for the first time, a silence that no longer carried resentment. We didn't get back together. 22 years couldn't be fixed by one moment of reckoning in a courtroom, and we both understood that. But in the months that followed, as we sorted out the asset division together, welcomed Mia home for Thanksgiving, the first time the three of us sat at the same table since the divorce, or simply ran into each other at our daughter's final graduation ceremony, we started treating each other with something close to respect, something that, perhaps, in 22 years of marriage, we'd never fully given each other. Ethan called me on my first birthday after the divorce, not to say anything scripted, but just to ask if I was okay, and this time, when he asked, I felt like he actually wanted to know the answer. I used the assets I received from the settlement, along with a small amount I'd saved over the years, to establish a mental health support fund for medical and relief workers who had served in disaster and conflict zones, people who, like me, had learned to stay silent because they believed their own steadiness mattered more than their own pain. We named the fund the Priya Malik Fund, with the full support and involvement of her family. Dania, Priya's son, now a graduate starting his medical residency, became one of the fund's first volunteers, spending his free time organizing talks for young medical workers just back from their first relief missions, people, he said, who needed to hear that admitting you need help isn't a weakness. Thomas Herrera, the rescue engineer I'd saved twice, became one of the fund's first donors, and regularly stopped by our small rented office to fix whatever needed fixing, his way, I think, of continuing to pay it forward. When the final divorce decree was issued, Judge Reyes, though she hadn't personally witnessed the moment Judge Chen recognized me, had read through the entire case file, including the transcript of the earlier hearing, and added a note beyond the standard legal language at the end of her ruling. This court has presided over many divorces in its career, but rarely has it witnessed a case where a person's true worth was only seen after she had nearly been erased entirely from the story of her own life. There are people who spend their whole lives never being seen, because they believe that's the only way to keep saving others, to keep being the support no one has to thank. This court hopes that, from today forward, Mrs. Claire Bennett will allow herself to be seen, not only by those she has saved, but by herself. A year after the hearing ended, I stood in the small office of the Priya Malik Fund, looking out the window toward the park where we'd just held our first fundraiser. Mia stood beside me, now a senior in college, considering a degree in social work, she said, in part, because what she witnessed in that courtroom had changed how she thought about what it means to help someone. "Do you regret it?" she asked me. Staying silent for so long. I thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "Yes," I said. "I regret letting silence become a habit, to the point where it almost stole the chance for the people I love to really know who I am. But I don't regret spending my life helping others. I just wish I'd learned sooner that those two things don't have to cancel each other out, that I could be both the person who saves others, and the person who lets herself be seen, supported, loved, without having to prove her worth through quiet sacrifice." Mia nodded, quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you think Dad really changed? Or was that just a moment, under the pressure of the courtroom?" "I don't know for sure," I answered honestly. "But I don't think it matters whether your father completely changed or not. What matters is that, for the first time in 22 years, he truly saw me, even if only for a moment. And sometimes, one real moment of being seen means more than years spent living side by side without either person truly seeing the other. A person's worth doesn't end when they take off the white coat, or shed the role someone else assigned them, or get described in a courtroom with words that don't reflect what they've actually given. And sometimes, the greatest strength isn't the ability to save others, isn't the capacity to endure in silence without asking for anything in return, it's learning, finally, to let yourself be helped, to be seen, to be acknowledged. I spent most of my life learning how to hold someone else's breath for them, learning how to steady people in the worst moments of their lives. But it took standing in a courtroom, being called useless by the very person I'd once promised to spend my life with, to teach me the hardest lesson of all, that silence, even when it's rooted in love and the desire to protect the people around you, can also become a kind of self-erasure, and that sometimes, the greatest gift you can give the people who love you isn't quiet sacrifice, but honesty, so they have the chance to actually see you, even if that means revealing the wounds you've spent years trying to hide.